Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Well, good morning, everybody. So great to be here with all of you. So great to be here with all these amazing panelists. My name is Carlos Fernandez. I'm the Colorado State Director for the Nature Conservancy, and I am really honored to be part of the Conference on World Affairs at CU this year, 75th anniversary. Just for recording purposes, today is Friday, April 14th. It is 9:01 a.m., so we're starting almost on time. The title of our panel today is Colorado River Crisis. How do we get here? So just to give you a little bit of explanation of what we're seeing today. So we have two panels today. This one is the first panel, Colorado River Crisis, how do we get here? The second panel would be 20 minutes after ending this panel, and that is focused on where do we go from here as well. And our lead panelists are all anxious and looking on the other side as well, and so I'm deeply honored. Both of them are great. It's just more publicity that if you have time, please stay because we're off to a treat. These are really experts. And I will tell you, many of you may have seen the newspaper. This week is a very important week for the Colorado River. And the fact that we have some of the people negotiating on behalf of Colorado at this table earlier today were semi-joking how lucky we are, because I was a little bit nervous when the news came up on Tuesday that we may need to change panelists. But here we are, and we don't, and they're so committed to this that I'm so lucky that they are still with us and they came and committed. So thank you very much. Yeah. So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that Boulder is on the ancestral lands and unceded territory of indigenous peoples who have traversed, lived in, and steward lands in the Boulder Valley since time immemorial. Those indigenous nations include the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. And I will tell you that we have a member of the Ute, Mountain Ute, my dear friend Regina Lopez-Weiskamp, sitting over there. She's going to be part of the second panel, so thank you, Regina, very much for being here. I would like to mention that before we get started with the panel, we are going to allocate around 20 minutes for Q&A. And the way that we're going to be doing that is using these scorecards or note cards as well. So the producers of this panel, Karen will be here with me. My request to all of you is if you have questions for us, please raise your hand. Karen will be circulating the note cards. For students in the room, please write down student because CU has asked us to prioritize student questions as well. My kind request to all of you is please go straight to the point. Please ask a question. Don't start with a lot of statements because we will have limited period of time. As you can see, this room is almost full. And so I want to make sure that I prioritize. My commitment to all of you, knowing how many of you are here, is try to categorize the themes of the questions to make sure that the panelists have enough time to answer that as well. So without further ado, let's get started. I would like to introduce each of these amazing panelists, and I think you're going to be as impressed with them as I am. I have been very lucky to work with them. So on my left is Eric Kuhn. Eric is a retired Colorado River District General Manager. Eric did that for over 30 years. So as you can imagine, he has a lot of experience on the Colorado River, and you're going to hear from him. Next on the left is Ann Castle. Ann Castle is a senior fellow for the Getches Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment at the University of Colorado. But importantly enough for this particular panel is that she is a federal commission appointed by President Biden for the Upper Colorado River Commission. Next to Ann is Becky Mitchell. Becky Mitchell is the Executive Director of the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And most importantly, or equally important, I would say, for this panel as well, is the fact that she is the Colorado negotiator, or on behalf of the state of Colorado, before the Colorado River Compact and the law of the river on the Colorado. So if there is one person that these days you're going to see a lot and hear a lot on the negotiations on the Colorado, that's Becky Mitchell, and we're very lucky that Becky, with all the pressure of this week, you're still here with us. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So let me share with you how we're going to do this. So each of the panelists, we have between 10 and 12 minutes. I'm going to be asking general questions for them. Then there's going to be a question for all of them. But what I have also asked, because I witnessed this early today when we were waiting for the panel, is they have so much experience that when someone says something, the other one will be complementing. And so I want that dialogue to happen as well, so we're going to allow for that time. And then we're going to allow for the 20 minutes of Q&A towards the end. Is that clear? Thank you very much. So, Eric, let's start with you. So, again, 30 years, over 30 years being the Colorado River District General Manager, you have seen a lot on this Colorado River, more than just the news that several of us have been seeing in the newspaper lately as well. And so can you provide us some history of the Colorado River, how it has been managed, how that has shaped the management of the river, and a little bit about the law of the river as well?
Well, thank you, and wow, great turnout, and I'm really honored to be here. Like was introduced, my background is, I worked as a water resources engineer, worked for the West Slopes Colorado River District for 37 years, a big portion of that as the general manager. After I retired a few years ago, I thought, what could I do that would be interesting? And I love the river, so I started to go in and do some detailed analysis of the history of the development of the river. And I've really enjoyed that. Along with my co-author, John Fleck, we wrote a book called Science Be Damned, but I've written a number of other papers about the background. And one of my initial observations that I want to make is the river that was negotiated, the law of the river was developed for a river that probably no longer exists. Maybe I can even say more, it really doesn't exist anymore. And it doesn't exist for a number of reasons. The primary one is climate change, but also politics and our human values. So the human values and the hydrology that formed the basis of this Colorado River Compact and other features of the law of the river really have fundamentally changed, but the governance hasn't. And that's led us to some real interesting issues. And it underlies the conflict. Now, pointing out the history is fun for me, but some of the folks that read it don't like it because their preference is to say, well, no, I don't like what they had to say. I've had some dialogue with some folks in Colorado, and they go, where did you find that quote? Well, that was from Delph Carpenter. He just happened to be Colorado's commissioner, and he wrote the compact. So if you have a problem with that quote, you should think about that. So a little background on the river. The river is about 250,000 square miles drainage area, about 1/12 of the continental 48 states. It drains about 80 to 90% of the drainage area is desert. Most of the water that flows in the river originates in a small portion of the basin over an elevation about 8,000 to 8,500 feet, because that's where the snow is. That's where it rains. So, and where is most of that? Well, about 70% of that's in the state of Colorado. So you have a big river. It's shared by 7 states in the United States, 2 states in Mexico, and it's very modest in flow. The Colorado River natural flow is about the same as the Illinois River or the Hudson, yet it drains 1/12 of the United States. Compare it with the Columbia. The Columbia drains about 250,000 square miles. its natural flow at the mouth, and we use something called an acre foot, which is, you know, football field a foot deep in water, 325,000 gallons. That's most of the world uses cubic meters. We use acre feet. And the natural flow of the river is somewhere around 15 to 20 million acre feet. It's going down. The Columbia is over 200 million, and it drains the same drainage area. So it's a really small river. The Mississippi is over 500 million. So you can see the competition for the resource really began a long time ago. And development of the large-scale development of the river began in the early 1900s. In 1901, the water from the Colorado River was moved by gravity down near Yuma into what's called the Colorado River Desert. Today we call it the Imperial Valley. They named it the Imperial Valley for marketing purposes. It's a large desert area below sea level. It's a part of the Colorado. It's not a part of the Colorado River drainage area, but it's a part of the basin. It exists because of the Colorado River. The Salton Sink, or the Imperial Valley as we now call it, is a part of the delta. And between plate tectonics and all of the material that the sediment that the river carries down, it deposited that over millions of years, and it's very fertile. They can irrigate 12 months out of the year. And as soon as there was water, there was a huge development. Now the river's also quite variable. And what they found is in 1905, they started diverting water in 1901. In 1905, the entire river made its way into what was called the Alamo Canal, made its way back into the Salton Sink, and created what we call today the Salton Sea. Now, that had been going on for eons before this. You know, if the river got really high, what would it do? It would flow backwards into the Salton Sink. It would fill up the Salton Sink, and it would redirect its course to the Pacific Ocean, actually the Gulf of Baja California. So that's natural. That variability has been there a long time. But to deal with flooding, to deal with hydroelectric development, to deal with certainty of water supply. We talk about no water makes it to the Colorado River, or from the Colorado River makes it to the Gulf of California. That's a recent event? No. In 1915, which was a dry year and a wet period, we swept the river, as they call it. We took all of the available river. Now, there were leaky diversion systems, so it probably wasn't as much, but they took as much as they physically could. They dried up the river before it reached the Gulf of Baja California, 1915, and again in 1917. So development of the river was something that people were pushing for early on. You know, what the dynamics then led to was that California wanted federal help to build what is now Hoover Dam. It was called the Boulder Canyon Project Act. The upper river states said, wait a minute, there's something called prior appropriation. First in time is first in right. And they feared that if the big projects on the lower river would command the river, and they used their power in the Senate to block the federal authorization of what is now Hoover Dam. In 1920, a guy from Greeley named Delph Carpenter suggested that we enter into a compact. A compact is nothing more than a contract between the states that's approved by Congress. So that compact was negotiated in 1922. Their original goal was to apportion water among 7 states. They failed. And they agreed. They failed miserably in doing that. But what they did as a consolation prize is they negotiated an agreement between 2 basins, an upper and a lower basin. So they divided the use of the water between 2 basins. They left the really hard work of apportioning water among the 7 states to future compacts. The upper basin did that in 1948. The lower basin states have never done it. There has never been an agreement. There's never been enough water in the river to satisfy Arizona and California from the beginning. It's probably, Becky can comment on this, but it's probably true today. So we have a situation where in 1922, in December, Delph Carpenter wrote a report to the Colorado General Assembly and the governor recommending approval of this compact ratification by the legislature. He described the hydrology. He said that there was 20.5 million acre-feet of water available. We've only apportioned 16, 8.5 for the lower basin, 7.5 for the upper basin. That 20.5 was down at Yuma. It's not at this place called Leaf Airy, it's at Yuma. So there was a 4.5 million acre-foot surplus. Today, if you look at it, my view is there's about 13 million down there, and when you add Mexican treaty 1.5 million that was signed in 1944 to the 16 million that was apportioned by the compact, you have 17.5. So we've gone from a surplus of 4.5 million to a deficit of 4.5 million, and we've overpromised the river, and that is basically sets up the problems we have today. Like I said, there's lots of the law of the river. The compact is the cornerstone. The compact, it took 6.5 years to ratify it. It was finally ratified in 1928, became effective in 1929. But one state, Arizona, refused to ratify it to 1944. So the compact has always been malleable. You know, the first thing that Carpenter said in 1924 after Governor Hunt in Arizona was reelected, and Hunt was reelected on a campaign of, let's suppose the compact was, well, we got to figure a way for Congress. We intended to do a 7-state compact. Let's figure out how to do a 6-state compact. And they went to Congress, and that's what they accomplished in 1928. So the bottom line, and I'll leave you with this, is the river that we set up, the management system, is being changed by climate change. It's the hydrology, the water is no longer there in long periods. And we're seeing that on both ends. We're seeing really big years and we're seeing really small years. Overall, the science suggests that the flows are going to be declining. So we're going to have to reallocate the river. That's what all the negotiations are. It's changing the allocation to meet the modern river. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ann.
Thank you very, very much. And we are, I'm sorry, go ahead. Louder, okay. We're gonna try to speak into a microphone as well closer. Thanks for that.
You'll be able to hear me, I promise.
And I see people walking. There's still some chairs, a couple of chairs as well here. So please join us if you have room. I see some people standing up in the back. Thank you. So, and you know, once again, you also have a lot of amazing experience by seeing a lot of these changes that Eric was mentioning as well. And so, how have you seen the basin and the Colorado River change over the past few decades on the 21st century? And how has that played a role into the current crisis as well? And I think the last question that I will ask, because of your current and past experience as well, is what has been the role of the federal agencies into that game as well?
Great. Can you hear me? Okay. And I'll pick up where Eric left off. Into the 21st century and the situation on the river and what has changed. And all of you are well informed. That's why you're here at this conference. So, and really, unless you've been living under a rock, you know that we've got a crisis in supply in the Colorado River Basin. We're in what is almost always referred to as an historic drought. Drought, that word is a little misleading. Because it implies something that's temporary and aberrational, and we're going to come out of it. But that's not what the climate scientists are telling us. Because our atmosphere is warming, we are going to continue to see lower flows, as Eric just described, in this, what was already not a huge river. And we have grown to depend on a lot more water than nature is providing us. Some of the scientific reports say that what we're experiencing right now in the 21st century in the Colorado River Basin, we haven't seen for 1,200 years. So we've got a new reality that we have to deal with. But there have been a number of efforts in the 21st century to deal with that new reality. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those efforts. The first major change on the river was something called the 2007 Guidelines, which is a record of decision from the Secretary of the Interior ordering different operations on the river, but it was really based on an agreement, a proposal that came from the 7 Colorado River Basin states. That came together in 2007, and one of the major features that people point to of those guidelines is a reduction schedule for the lower basin states of Arizona, California, and Nevada. Reduction schedule meaning at certain levels in Lake Mead, which is their big bucket where all the straws come out of that feed the various different water users in the lower basin. When Lake Mead reaches low levels, the amounts that those lower basin states get, those amounts are reduced. And that's a schedule that was agreed to in the 2007 guidelines. And we're still operating under those guidelines today. And they will continue to be in place until the end of 2025. The other thing that those guidelines did is they allowed for the lower basin states to defer some of their water deliveries and store that water in Lake Mead. Before 2007, there was no incentive for conservation. If a lower basin state didn't take its full allocation, it was gone. It went to the next priority water user in the system. So the 2007 guidelines also gave the lower basin states ability to store water in good times and have it there when they needed it. The next thing that happened on the river were several really groundbreaking agreements with Mexico. We have a treaty with Mexico that Eric referred to, and we've reached agreements between the US and Mexico that provide for Mexico to take shortages when Lake Mead levels are low. Those agreements have also provided for joint environmental efforts and allowed Mexico to store some of its water in US reservoirs because there aren't any big storage reservoirs in the Mexican part of the Colorado River system. So those have been really groundbreaking agreements that have been noticed all around and emulated across the globe, really. The next iteration of agreements came together in 2019, recognizing that the continuing dry conditions that we're seeing in the basin made it so that the previous measures were not enough to save the system. So in 2019, again, the 7 basin states came together with the federal government and put together drought contingency plans. And in the lower basin, the drought contingency plan basically deepened the cuts in deliveries that were agreed to in the 2007 guidelines. So at those same levels in Lake Mead, there's a bigger reduction than would have occurred without the drought contingency plan. And it got a lot more complicated, and it started at higher levels in Lake Mead, but the whole idea was we were seeing the reservoirs tank, and we were trying to get after the problem in the lower basin. And it is also true that because the lower basin states have this big bucket in Lake Mead, it's sort of like a savings account, they were able to use more water than was allocated in the Colorado River Compact, but also more water than was coming down from Lake Powell. So that excess use in the lower basin was causing the reservoirs to go down, and the drought contingency plan was an effort to get after that problem. In the upper basin, 2 major components of the drought contingency plan. The first one is called drought response operations, and this is a set of rules that are designed to protect critical elevations in Lake Powell. We want Lake Powell to be able to continue producing hydropower. That is a big part of the electrical grid in the southwestern United States. And we also wanted Lake Powell to be able to continue to deliver the amount of water that is owed to the lower basin so that the upper basin can comply with the Colorado River Compact that Eric described. And so drought response operations call for extraordinary releases from reservoirs that are further upstream from Lake Powell, like Flaming Gorge Reservoir and Blue Mesa here in Colorado, in order to prop up levels in Lake Powell and keep them from going too low. The other component of the drought contingency plan in the upper basin is what we call demand management investigation. Demand management is another word for water conservation, but this conservation would be voluntary and compensated and temporary. And so people would use less water, get paid for doing that, and we'd store that water in Lake Powell or other upper basin reservoirs to have it available for our use in the future. That demand management program is being investigated in each of the upper basin states. The agreement didn't create a program. It called for investigation of the feasibility and allowed certain operational things to occur that would facilitate having a demand management or water conservation program. So all of those things are in place in the 21st century, but we're still watching the reservoirs go down. Today, Lake Powell is below the target elevation that was intended to be maintained by those components of the drought contingency plans. Lake Powell is about 23% full, and that's a little misleading because that includes water that we can't get out of the reservoir because it's below the lowest outlets in the reservoir. So functionally, Lake Powell is at even less capacity than that. Lake Mead is at about 28%. These reservoirs are very, very low. We have to do more. And Becky is going to talk about what more is being done. But one thing that I wanted to address that Carlos asked about is what can the federal government do? Because you will read in the papers and naturally ask the question, why doesn't the Department of the Interior do something about this? The states haven't been able to get it together. And there are things in motion that the federal government is doing, but I think it's important to understand the limitations on the federal role in water management in general. The Secretary of the Interior does have authority in the Colorado River Basin. She is the water master in the lower basin, just in the lower basin. And that's because of a bunch of statutes and Supreme Court decisions. If you want to use water in the lower basin, you have to have a contract with the Secretary of the Interior. But one of the things when I was with the Department of the Interior, and people would come and say, why don't you do something? Because it would be fair, because you really ought to. But the question that the Interior folks have to ask themselves is, do we have the authority to do that? And who's going to pay? And those two questions were always first on the list whenever anybody wanted action. The who's going to pay part is probably easier right now because of the bipartisan infrastructure law and other appropriations that Congress has done. But the authority question is always there, and Interior and Reclamation's authority is limited. And even when they have authority, they have to ensure that there's environmental compliance. Any federal action, even if they have the authority to do it, has to be analyzed for its environmental impacts. We're in the throes of that today. So I'll just end by saying we have huge challenges on the Colorado River. As Eric said, we have a big deficit between supply and demand. And that deficit is large enough so that no one basin, no one state, no one sector of the economy can address it by themselves. It has to be an overall effort in the basin, an agreement among the states and the tribes and the federal government and the major water users. And I'll turn it to Becky and back to Carlos to talk about how that's coming together.
Thank you, Anna, very much. So a couple of reminders before I go to Becky. So there are two additional producers in the back of the room. We can see them, Ian and Jackson. So please, this is the time for you to start thinking about what are the questions. I saw some hands. They will come with, to you with note cards as well. So please raise your hand and they will be able to approach you while we go into the last panelist of this panel before the Q&A. The other thing, and I'm sorry I didn't mention this as well, but their full bios, I just did literally a title, are in the website of the Conference of Water Affairs, so you can go there. And also, there are different presentation handouts that they have put together that are being uploaded as well. So you can go and kind of download what they are saying with the real numbers, all the handouts they put together, they can be found there as well. And also an article published on the LA Times, not like a couple of weeks ago, that my colleague Taylor hosts. All of that is on the Conference of Water Affairs website. So just want to mention for those of you taking notes or something, there is one more gentleman, two more. Sir? There's two more people raising their hands there. Thank you. So I'm just mentioning this so you can find some of this information, which is very technical, on their handouts. So thank you about that. So, Becky, last but not least, and really important. So, you know, again, we are seeing this on the news, particularly this week. This past Tuesday, SEIS. Can you please describe to us what is currently happening between the basin states to meet the needs of these stakeholders, as both Eric and I were mentioning as well, but also what does it mean SEIS and what are the mandates from the federal government?
And thank you for that question, Carlos. So if you have been opening your computer or the newspaper or any social media, you've probably heard about the crisis on the Colorado River and the drought and what is happening and the lowering levels of Lake Powell and Lake Mead and the need to do something. And so there's been multiple calls to action, and one of them has occurred this week. So I'll get a little bit into that. It's what we call a draft supplemental EIS. And so the 07 guidelines came out of an environmental impact statement, so EIS, environmental impact statement. And what has occurred this week is basically an acknowledgement of those agreements and the agreements that have followed since, the ones that we've heard about, the drought contingency plan, have not been enough to protect the system. The system for the 40 million people that rely on it, the 2 countries, the 7 states, the 30 tribes, the multiple industries, the agricultural economies, the local communities, the environment. So it's this acknowledgement that what agreements are out there are not enough. And so a couple things have happened, and I'd like to touch on the dates so that to make sure you kind of know how this is playing out. On June 14th of last year, the Bureau of Reclamation Commissioner, Camille Touton, called on the 7 Colorado River Basin states to conserve 2 to 4 million acre-feet of water in the coming year to protect the system, the whole entire Colorado River system. And really, those numbers were not just flippantly pulled out of the air. There was we knew that was what was needed to protect the system. We knew that if we were going to continue seeing the hydrology that we were seeing, that was going to be what's needed. And I consider this a little more simple than I think what others may consider it. more is going out of these reservoirs than is coming in. That is pretty simple to me in terms of that's not sustainable and not responsible. And so the commissioner also acknowledged that in June. In July of 2022, the upper division states, you heard them, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming, we responded. We tried to come together as 7 states. That was difficult. And I think I'll get into a little bit of why that's difficult at times. But the upper basin states responded to that call to action with a 5-point plan. You heard Commissioner Castle talk about that. And we've already begun implementing it. And we're implementing it on the ground. And it involves conservation. It involves reliable and responsible use of the water in the upper basin. I think one thing that's important to also recognize at this point is that the upper basin states live on the front lines of climate change. We do not have these reservoirs above us that moderate these flows, the incredibly large reservoirs. We live with what Mother Nature provides on an annual basis. So when it snows, that's our water supply. And so we know what's going to happen. We know those dry years, it's going to be tough. And we suffer. And I can tell you stories upon stories of suffering. And so we responded. The lower basin states were unable to come up with a plan for conservation. And so on November 17th of 2022, the Bureau of Reclamation announced initiating this process for a supplemental EIS, and really to focus on revising these current operations guidelines because they're not, they're insufficient to given the current hydrology and reservoir conditions and kind of where we were getting with the low runoff conditions in the next few years in the Colorado River Basin. It's an acknowledgement that the way that we're operating isn't protecting the system and the 40 million people that rely on it. And I think that is a step in the right direction alone. And so on January 30th of this year, 6 of the basin states, so Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Wyoming, we tried to get California on, but we just couldn't quite get it. Came up with a consensus-based modeling approach that to analyze in this process that we're currently in. California came up with their own, and really to address the shortages that are happening, primarily in the lower division states. Remember, I said we live on the front lines of climate change, so we are responding. Unfortunately, what's happened with how these reservoirs are operating and the operations that are occurring in the lower basin states, they've become reliant on something that is no longer there. And so it's created this expectation and that we've never, I think you've heard both of these folks talk about, we've never been able to satisfy California or Arizona, but really, I think it's whatever is there they will take and use, but we have to be thinking about the next years. We have to be thinking about the next generations at the same time. And so this acknowledgement of this not working is a huge step forward. And it's saying we absolutely have to do something, and the secretary will do something to protect the system. So the compact, again, is our foundation, and it is, again, that agreement between the 7 basin states. And the layering of agreements is what is complicating but helpful at the same time. So a little bit about what's in that SEIS, and I have to give the caveat that it is posted in the Federal Register today. There was a release of it on Tuesday. It is 500 pages, and so I have to say I will comment a little, but I would like, call me in a couple weeks, and I can give you a more in-depth perception. But what I see, they're looking at 3 essentially alternatives. One of those always has to be a no-action alternative. And what no action means is we operate under the current agreements that we have. So continued drought, lower elevations, dropping even further elevations in those reservoirs, so we lose any opportunities for additional storage. And then, so that's kind of the no action, essentially just going forward. Then one of the actions is cuts up to about 2.083 million acre feet, operating under strict priority in the lower basin states of California, Arizona, and Nevada. And then the action number 2 is where the secretary uses her authority on health and human safety, and there's a straight line cut across contracts out of Meade, about 13% across those contracts. And so, you know, it's this concept of what is fair, what is necessary, what is needed. But I think more importantly, it helps us focus on how do we do things different in the future, and how do we respond to Mother Nature in real time? How do we live within the means of the river? How do our next set of guidelines, which we are in the process of, I think there'll be an initiation of the formal negotiations starting here soon about how we're going to operate these reservoirs going into the future. And so what I think we've learned from the 07 guidelines is there's been a way to use those that may not have necessarily benefited the entire system or all the people that rely on it, or the environmental systems and the economies that rely on it and the countries that rely on it. So we have learned from some of this. And in defense of those that negotiated those guidelines, I have to say there was about a 3% chance that we would see the hydrology that we were seeing now. And so when those were negotiated, it wasn't, oh, we're just flippantly making it. They really looked at the science behind it, and but we have to find ways to respond quicker to what science is telling us. We have always lived within the means of the river in the upper basin, and so as we look towards the future, I think those are what we have learned in the upper basin, I think are the lessons that we're going to have to teach everyone, is how to respond immediately to what Mother Nature is saying. We talk about the Secretary and the Department of Interior's authorities. The Secretary is the water master in the lower basin. We don't necessarily need that up here because we operate within what Mother Nature provides. And so how do we take those lessons, right? And so make sure that others are aware of, okay, what are the red flags? What are the triggers that are out there that we're seeing to say, okay, we need to cut back. And maybe cutting back sooner helps us for sustainability into the future. And so as we live on the front lines of climate change, we hope that others can be as responsive, because I think we need that. And we also need an inclusive process. And I think as we talk about how guidelines have been negotiated and operated, there are people that have been left out this whole time. There are thoughts that have been left out. So I want to take just a minute to talk about the Colorado River and Colorado's commitment to the tribal nations. There are specifically 2 tribes that reside within the boundaries of the state of Colorado that are part of that are 2 of the 30 tribes that rely. So I can only speak about the Ute Mountain Ute and Southern Ute and Colorado's relationship with those. The tribal nations were not consulted in the 1922 Colorado River Compact and when it was negotiated. So it's essential that we correct those wrongs. And so the 7 basin states, the federal government must include and engage those tribal sovereigns in the post-2026 reservoir negotiations. I'm hopeful that we'll continue to work with all the tribes. The commitment in Colorado is that we absolutely will work with our tribal sovereigns, and we try to exemplify that with the regular consultation with the Ute Mountain Ute and Southern Ute, and then the Upper Colorado River Commission does the same across the 4 Upper Basin states. So I think it's important that we do things better, and as we look at what success means and what that looks like, oftentimes it's acknowledging things that we could have done better, that we should have done better, and that we can absolutely do better. And so when I talk about the story of the Colorado River, I don't consider it a story of hopelessness. I think oftentimes when you see the media, it is about despair, and fear sells, right? And so that is what gets people's attention. But I think we have to continue to rise above that, look at the facts, look at the science behind it, and hopefully that drives us in the right direction. We have the tools to solve this. We just need the collective resolve and determination to implement them in a thoughtful way. And I think if there's a lesson to be learned from the last few years is, again, that we have to hear Mother Nature's cries. We have to all live within the means of the river if we are to sustain it for our future generations. And so I take that philosophy, I take that mission with me into these rooms, that it's not just about Colorado, it's not just about the Upper Basin states, but it is about the 40 million people, the 2 countries, the 7 states, the 30 tribes. So thank you.
Thank you, Becky. So thank you very much. There's more hands. As you can see from what I'm trying to do, there's a lot of questions. So I'm trying to kind of categorize them, and I'm trying to, as I mentioned before, at the request of CU, prioritize students' questions as well. So let me, the good thing is that some of them are related, some of them are not related at all. So I'll try to do my best. I also would like, so keep thinking about this, because 5 minutes before we finish, I would like to allow these panels, my dear panelists, just to think about one question I'm going to ask and your final thoughts. And that is, what do you see as the biggest opportunity for the future of the river? So if you don't mind thinking about that while we answer the questions, that would be great. So let me start with some of the students' questions, which are really great. So thank you very much. So I think this goes, to Becky, but it could be to any of you as well. It is, how has the influence of climate change deniers impacted the negotiations over water usage in recent years? Will this significantly impact your ability to renegotiate a better Colorado River Compact?
Listen, I don't really care what your beliefs are in terms of whether climate change is real or not. It doesn't really matter to me. I hate to say that, but I will. What matters to me is the science and facts. And what we're seeing is, and you heard Commissioner Castle talk about the aridification. And so when we look at really many years with far less water available, or the timing of its runoff, these are facts. These are science. And whatever you call it, I don't care. But that's the triggers that we need to operate within. And so less water is available. That's it.
Great.
Thank you, Becky.
Yeah. And can I?
Anyway, yeah, please.
Can I just add that it's always been the job of water managers to be able to continue to provide water to their users. You'll hear from Jim Lockhead during the next panel. It's his job to make sure that Denver water customers have water coming out of their taps. So they've always had to think about worst case scenarios, because that's their job. If they didn't do that, they wouldn't be in that position very long. So water managers look at the numbers, just like Becky was saying, and they have to assume that what we're seeing right now is not aberrational. It's going to continue. So the climate denialism, I think, kind of doesn't matter because, as Becky said, we're looking at the facts, we're looking at the numbers. We have to deal with what we're seeing in the basin.
Can I add on a little bit? I think as it goes to water managers, I mean, we hope for the best, but you plan for the worst. And what we saw was in the previous set of guidelines that, again, that 3%, the reason I bring it up is because we didn't expect what we're seeing. And so we have to start figuring out how do we plan for what we can't even expect, and then how do we respond when those things happen. On the flip side of that, there may be years that we have lots of water, more than we expect. How do we use that opportunity? How do we save it for the years that we don't?
Yeah, I would like to add, though, one thing, which is where I think the water community, and I can say this because I'm retired, has failed. And that's when it comes to climate change. Yeah, the water managers accept climate change. Where they stop is in recognizing that the conditions of climate change are because of greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll just point to a hearing that was in Arizona where two of the major water managers were asked, is the problem climate change? And the answer was yes. And the answer, when they were asked, is that human-caused climate change? Both deferred and wouldn't answer. So you can see where water managers have failed is in taking the next steps in saying that it's not going to be, the future is not going to look very good for their successors if we don't deal with the root causes of climate change.
Thank you. And I know you all are so knowledgeable that you jump to every single question, but I would like to ask more questions rather than less. So just FYI to my dear panelists.
I take that hint.
Another question from student, which I think is, the following two questions are going to be related to the categories of impact of climate change. And so, what legal weight does the definition of drought carry, and should that definition shift in response to the new normal of climate change?
Well, I'm not sure we have a good legal definition of drought. And as I was mentioning, it's kind of not a good descriptor. It's a convenient word to use, and you see it in all the press reports about the Colorado River, but it's not really accurate because it does convey that we're in this difficult period, but we're going to come out of it. That's not what we think is likely. And so there are, emergency declarations when droughts occur, and there's going to be a huge impact on crops. But those tend to be short-term. FEMA steps in and there's federal money available. That's not what we've got here. We have a long-term issue. We need to rebalance the system. So I think that the term drought leads us in the wrong direction.
Thank you. Related to that as well, and to the impacts on climate, is there any effort to reduce evaporation from rivers and lakes?
Well, if the reservoirs have less water in them, there's less evaporation because there's less surface area.
I think first, don't you think, Eric, that we should account for the evaporation?
Yeah, and well, we need to assess evaporation as a consumptive use, but and I know in some places they're doing things like putting solar panels on top of canals. And that's going to hit at the margin, but I don't think there's going to be any real physical way of reducing evaporation off Lake Mead and Lake Powell in the future. It's going to happen. It's thermodynamics.
Thank you. This question is going to be a great question for this panel, but also is going to set the stage for the next panel, and that is, can you please break down the usage of water that supports the Colorado River and each one of the states?
Yeah, let me just think about the big picture, where where the water use is, and I round off to the nearest percentages, 10%. About of the water use in the basin right now, about 70% goes to agriculture, about 15 to municipal, and about 15 to evaporation. So you can see there's a lot of evaporation. There's several million acre feet, and we knew that in 1922 when we negotiated the compact. By the way, that wasn't new. So irrigation is the big use. States, it varies, but I don't know that there's any state where irrigation isn't the largest single use. People, you don't use a lot of water in-house. Where they use water is if they have lawns. So I'll leave it with that. One of the things I say is the future of the Colorado River is going to be about how we manage grass. And that's grass for lawns, it's grass for cows, it's alfalfa, it's for Saudi Arabian camels, whatever you have it, but it's managing consumptive use from outdoor irrigation and crops. That's the name of the game.
But don't forget, Eric, all of these people eat. And when we talk about agriculture, a lot of that is how you consume. And so while we talked about the 70% to ag, I think it's important to remember you are a component of that also. Yes, there is alfalfa grown, and that is for beef, and some of that alfalfa is exported. But don't forget, your individual consumptive use is not just what happens in your home. You are a part of all of it. And so I think we cannot make one industry an enemy or one issue an enemy. It has to be everybody coming together. And so recognizing what you are doing and the impacts of that. So
Thank you both.
I have to add one more.
Yeah, go ahead. I have one more correlated question to this same topic, so yeah.
But the question about how's the use allocated, there's a whole bunch of ways to slice and dice these numbers. So one other way is about 70% of the overall use in the basin is by the lower basin states, about 30% by the upper basin states. And within all of that, 20 to 25% of the water in the basin goes to tribal nations. And they have the most senior rights in the system. Some of those are not fully developed. They have settlements and decrees that give them a certain quantity of water, but they haven't been able to take that water because they don't have the infrastructure necessarily. Those are parts of the equation here, because those are, the tribal rights in particular, those are obligations of the United States to the tribes that resulted from our putting them on reservations back in the late 1800s. We need to give them the amount of water required to sustain those reservations. So think about that as well.
Thank you. Some brief answer, you may say yay or nay, or we may skip it, but same question when with respect to national versus foreign countries' use of our water. And the questions go to recent newspaper articles about 30% of the Colorado River being used for alfalfa goes to China and Saudi Arabia. Any answers with respect to that?
No, all I'm going to say is the irrigation, the agricultural community is a market. They're going to, they're a business, and they're going to grow produce and produce products that their market wants, period.
And also keep in mind, we may be exporting alfalfa to Saudi Arabia, and that's kind of a scary soundbite. But we get lots of imports in the global economy that also have a water footprint, right?
Yeah.
It's a global economy. Yeah. There is trade going all different ways across borders, and so it's not terribly useful to focus only on one crop going one way.
What's that? Thank you. This is about, I'm looking at Becky, but it can be expanded. Water seems like it should be a bipartisan issue. what is the Colorado State Legislature responding on this issue? And do you have any very clear political roadblocks to solving this?
I absolutely agree with that question, which it should be a bipartisan issue. And I would say that in Colorado, it primarily is. It primarily is. I think we've also seen the benefits of it, that it's not about Democrat or Republican, and that where we stand to have the most benefit is when we break down the barriers between urban and agriculture, or environment and agriculture, or East Slope or West Slope. That's where we see the most success, when we find out what's in common, rather than where our differences are. And so in terms of roadblocks, I would say there's a heavy support, and there's almost a focus on, we've got to do something, we've got to do something, we've got to do something. And oftentimes we have to look and say, okay, what is being done? Where are our successes? Where have we had success? And focus on that intersection of what we actually agree on. I think we're seeing heavy support. There is an initiative to have more staffing associated with Colorado River issues, not just in Colorado, but across the board. We're seeing that in every state, folks being more focused on it. There's a heavy focus on the technical and science, building the capacity there, and I think that's incredibly important. A focus on the facts, and the facts are, I will always go there because those are the facts, and we can rely on those. So I would say we've been really moving forward within Colorado, and I would say across the board, it's we've seen support even up to the federal level on both Democrat and Republican side. There's also interest in both sides of the houses in every state. So.
Thank you. One last question before your final thoughts, and I can repeat my question again, but this is about the impact that this year's historic snowfall are having on the water levels of the Colorado. And some people go to like Lake Powell, and some others have been asking me about, what about California? You know, can we do something to capture the runoff from California? So it's along the same lines, and I try to merge two in one because I want to give 5 minutes for the last statement from each one of you. So anyone would like to answer the question about so much snowfall, 130% this year in Colorado?
Well, we've had good years in the past. 2011, it was followed by 2012, and 13 was a drought year. 2019 was an epic year for snow, and 2020 was a drought. So we got to look long term. I will say climate, what's happened with 31 atmospheric rivers hitting California coast, that's very predictable by climate change. Mm-hmm. The bigs are going to get bigger, and the dries are going to get drier and longer. So let's live with the long run. Let's take the long-term objective.
And again, when I said we hope for the best but plan for the worst, I think good year, yeah, that's great. But it's what we do with it that matters. It's how we respond, and that's what says who we are. Do we waste this 1 year? That's when history looks back on this leadership in what we're looking at right now. They will say, did they prepare? Did they read the tea leaves when the last few years had been dry? Did they take action when this happened? Like, whatever this year has brought, are we thankful for it? Yes. But that doesn't matter. It's what we do with it. And so this isn't, I don't say this just for these people in the room, but for those that are also listening, it's incredibly important that we use this to save for a dry day. And that's how we will be judged.
Thank you. My last question, the last 5 minutes, final statement from each one of you. What do you see as the biggest opportunity for the future of the river?
I think crises produce movement, and we certainly are in a crisis right now, despite a good year. And I think that the decision makers in the Colorado River system are not distracted by one above average year. We know what the long-term trend has been. We know what we have to deal with. But the very dry conditions, the low reservoir levels, they will spur action. And we're seeing that right now. Another thing that I am encouraged by is the engagement of the tribal nations in the discussions around what to do and in the coming together around solutions. There's been, and I want to give Becky so much credit for her championing of engagement with the tribes in Colorado and all of the tribal sovereigns that are part of the Colorado River system. We have seen, because of Becky's leadership in Colorado, very robust participation by the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe and the Southern Ute Tribe in these discussions around what's going on in the river. And that is being replicated in other parts of the basin. You may have read in the newspaper just recently that because we've got money available from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, that deals were just reached with the Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation and the Gila River Indian community, both in Arizona, for significant payments to those communities to conserve water and contribute to the overall reduction in use that we have to achieve. Those are historic events. And again, they provide examples of how tribes can participate and themselves benefit, but also benefit the entire system. And finally, with respect to what hopeful things I'm seeing in the basin, also in connection with tribes, we know that there are many tribal households throughout the Colorado River Basin that do not have access to clean drinking water. That is a travesty in 2023. It's something that must be corrected. But we have money now, again, as a result of congressional appropriations, to make progress on fixing that problem. And money is being deployed. It's not everything we need. It's not the entirety of the fix, but we are making progress. And that is part of the unfinished business of our republic.
Thank you, Ann. Becky, Eric.
Yeah, I'll be real quick. I think one of the hopeful signs, and I'll be very technical, but this is a research university, is that we're moving away from stationary, a concept called stationarity, that we can plan for the future based on the past. And we're now looking at plausible futures. We're basically managing for deep uncertainty, or we're developing the skills to manage for deep uncertainty. And that is a revolutionary change in how we do resource management with water. And this institution is a part of that process.
Thank you. Becky?
So why I am hopeful is because we have no other options but success. And I think because this crisis train, the slowest moving crisis train with the most warning signs you've ever seen as the reservoirs have dropped, have left us no choices but success, right? We must do better, we must learn from our mistakes, and we must do better, and we must do it in an inclusive way. And I think that's gonna be critical. Yes, we have the money, but like what I said with the hydrology of this 1 year, how we are judged will be based on that. Same thing with the money. How we are judged will be if we use that money to line pockets of a few industries or individuals, or whether we use that money for permanent solutions that make a difference for our future generations. They have to be permanent reductions, and that money has to be associated with that. That is how we will be judged. So the water managers will be judged if we saw the technical science, if we saw the science. The legislature and the federal government and the folks that are using this money will be judged on if it accounted for real, measurable actions. And so when you ask what you can do, it is hold us accountable. Hold everyone accountable. Hold yourself accountable.
Thank you. So, a couple of announcements. First of all, thank you once again to our panelists right now for a great job. I am very hopeful because we have the type of leaders that we have on this panel and the ones that are coming up. And so we're finishing this panel 20 minutes back here at 10:30. If you don't have maps, there are maps in the back as well. For those of you, I just got a note that there are seating issues. So if you don't mind for the next panel sitting more into a center as well, there's a few spots over there so we can leave more room for people who have not been able to join us. That would be great. Back here, the same room, 10:30 for where do we go from here? Thanks.